or recording.
Excellent. Well, I want to welcome you all. Sorry for the slow start. The talk I'm going to give today, I've scheduled for about a little under an hour, and then stay on for about a half hour that Victor's going to lead us in answering questions or discussion. And it's all focused on First Parish and how we related to Indigenous and Black lives. And to give you a perspective to start from, it's probably important to take the broader view. So starting with first contact, Christopher Columbus's 1492 discovery of populated lands far across the Atlantic over the most distant western horizons of Europe's known world began an imperialist age of discovery. And how we talk about age really has a lot to do with the white supremacy culture. It became a race to see which nations of Europe could extract the most value from the peoples, flora, and fauna of this new world. Spain, with the blessings of the Pope, effectively captured and enslaved the peoples of the more tropical regions to put them to work extracting silver and gold and working under bestial conditions on vast forced labor agricultural plantations. This was one model of white supremacy. The English explorers re-examined Norse chronicles of sailing west from Iceland and Greenland to discover lands that they had named Vineland and Newfoundland and the native peoples that they discovered there. By 1607, the English had established semi-permanent fishing camps all along the coast, most prominently at the mouth of the Kennebec River in what would become Maine. So for hundreds of miles offshore, they harvested fishing grounds with an abundance of fish, especially cod. The English explorers and fishing fleets began to exploit these natural resources, including coming ashore to dry and salt their cod catch before their long journey home. They also captured some of the indigenous people to sell them into slavery, another source of income from that period. From the very start, contact between these distinctive cultures was exploitive. A deep, abiding belief in white supremacy existed from the very beginning of this interracial contact. So by the early 17th century, the Atlantic coastline of North America had been largely explored, its people, flora, and fauna studied, and there was growing pressure for the English crown to find ways to access the kind of enormous wealth being extracted by Spain from its more tropical colonies. Among the English theologians of the day, there remained a great diversity of opinion as to the human nature of these indigenous people, whether they could even be civilized, whether they were even qualified as being counted as fully human, or whether they were more akin to the natural wildlife. The early explorers mostly alternated between violent oppression and making peace with the indigenous people, trying to avoid all-out war since they were outnumbered, and instead engage in trade with them or for food or in furs or items they could acquire cheaply for sale in Europe. But communicable diseases that plagued the Europeans, to which the indigenous people had not been exposed in millennia, passed like wildfire through the indigenous villages, killing vast numbers. So the colonization of North America led to a kind of genocide, not always intentional, but with few attempts to avoid it, and proved very deadly nevertheless. The peoples of the North American coasts had been organized into stable and prosperous communities. A Nipmuc tributary tribe, or the Massachusetts Bay tribe, was living in the Musketaquid River Valley, where we are now in Concord. Estimates are up to 90% of the indigenous people along the coast succumbed to disease and death over the first decades of the 17th century, wiping out whole villages, and many of the Nipmuc people of Musketaquid also appear to have died, with some surviving by fleeing west to live with their Nipmuc cousins, even before there were any English to settle this fertile land at the confluence of three rivers. So by 1630, the largest Massachusetts tribes living around Massachusetts Bay had largely died off, with remnants of the tribe moving west to Musketaquid to settle meadows and fields abandoned by the Nipmuncs who had gone further west or who had died. So a shattered people took refuge with the remaining Nipmuncs in the Musketaquid area. This is the indigenous people first encountered by Simon Willard, a traumatized remnant of once mighty Massachusetts and Nipmuc indigenous people, in an egalitarian, family-centered, and relatively happy human community living on land that once had supported 5 or even 10 times as many people. They held their land in common. Private land ownership was completely unknown among them. so no one had the right to sell the land to others. By all accounts, they welcomed these strangers in their midst, hoping that people of goodwill could live peaceably enough together. The English colonists would learn to take great advantage of that wish. And to give you some sense, let me tell you a little what we know about Tehadawon. A Sagamore or local chief, Tehadawon was a survivor. His family lived in a large house formed of tree limbs and animal hides on a hill called Nishadak, overlooking the confluence of these three rivers that fed the Mesquitequit River watershed. As a teenager, he had watched a series of great and inexplicable plagues devastate his people year after year, with some survivors moving further west to live with their Nipmuc cousins. His people, like their eastern neighbors, the Massachusetts and Wampanoags, allied themselves with the English settlers of the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth plantations. But the Pequots to the south more often traded and allied with the Dutch of New Amsterdam, while the Mohicans and Pocumtuck further west, and especially the Abenaki, who were further north and more allied themselves and traded with French traders controlling the Hudson River Valley and points north. Circumstances forced all the indigenous tribes to pick sides. They could not survive without picking sides. And though alliances could shift, the enormous loss of life occasioned by these recurring outbreaks of plague forced new alliances upon them. When the mighty chief Nanapashamit of the Massachusetts tribe died in battle with the Abenaki, Tehadawon welcomed his widow, known to us only unfortunately as Squaw Sachem, and her new husband, the tribe's shaman, Weber Cowart, to bring their surviving family members and remaining followers to live with his tribe on Nishadak. This small group became part of a shrunken tribe of survivors living in Mesquitequid, uncertain what the future might hold for them. Tehadawon befriended the English fur trader Simon Willard, and through him was introduced eventually to Peter Buckley and his English colonists who wished to settle the open lands of Mesquitequid. Now, initially, communication was very difficult. Willard had begun to learn Algonquin, and Tehadawon encouraged his sons to learn English, though he never mastered it. Perhaps more importantly, through Willard, Tehadawon met Reverend John Eliot, who promised to lift the curse of plague from these indigenous people through conversion to Christianity and adopting English ways. Everyone in the tribe eventually converted to Christianity. So the die was cast, they became dependent upon the English, and they made the best of their situation. We should remember that Nishadak and its surrounding woods was an idyllic setting. Centuries later, Henry David Thoreau, perhaps Concord's most famous naturalist son, would spend hours walking in what he vividly imagined were Tehadawon's footsteps, finding arrowheads and pottery, imagining the lives of the indigenous people before the English colonists came. And Nathaniel Hawthorne and Concord's famous transcendentalists called this short section of the Assabat River along Nishadak perhaps the prettiest pastoral vista in America. It has always been so. When my family chose where to live in Concord, we too were drawn to these idyllic woods, so I now walk these woods with the spirit of the ancestors. Let me tell you what we know about Simon Willard. He's a key player in this settlement. Simon Willard was born in Hosmondon, England, in the county of Kent in early 1605. While christened in the Church of England, his family seems to have had Puritan tendencies at a time England was becoming far more hostile to religious nonconformists. His father had 3 wives and 10 children. Simon was his younger son of the second wife. His mother died when he was 3, and his father died before Simon reached the age of 12. So this ambitious son of a wealthy landowner didn't inherit the family estate. He became instead a trader of goods, and along with 2 of his siblings, eventually moved to New England. In his 20s, before departing England, he married a local teenager, Mary Shoppy, who soon gave birth to their first 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. So picture Willard at age 29, deciding to liquidate his inheritance and move his young family to New England, making him one of the wealthier and more ambitious of the first wave of English immigrants to this new land of opportunity. Over a long life, he would become one of the most prominent settlers of New England. And with 3 different wives, since each of his wives died in turn, he would father 17 children. The Willards seemed almost destined to become one of the foremost families of New England. But we know that on August 4th, 1634, Willard bought a house on 100 acres of land in what is now Boston's Brighton neighborhood. but within months he was spending most of his time trading with the indigenous people north and west of the colonial town of Boston. He became a trader in furs, particularly beaver fur, and secured the local monopoly on that trade. He learned Algonquin, the local language, and became quite familiar and friendly with the Hattawan and his tribal remnants in the Musquetaquid area west of the early Bay Colony colonial settlements. The following year, he heard the newly arrived Reverend Peter Buckley preaching in Newtown, what is now Cambridge, and became enthralled at the works-based theology of this Puritan clergyman. Buckley had a sizable following and was looking for a place to establish his own Puritan congregation. So Willard told him much promising information about Musquetaquid, and they decided to jointly petition the colonial legislature for a land grant to build the town of Concord, or Peace, here in Musquetaquid. So perhaps you should know a little bit about Reverend Peter Buckley. Reverend Buckley was of minor English nobility, descended in the 10th generation from Baron Robert Buckley, who as Lord Buckley helped force the Magna Carta on King John. Born at Odell, Bedfordshire, on January 31st, 1582, Peter received his Bachelor of Divinity from St. John's College, Cambridge, at the age of 18, and began a 25-year parish ministry in Odell. However, by 1635, Buckley was a 52-year-old nonconformist minister, threatened by Archbishop Laud with imprisonment if he continued to preach in England, so he quietly slipped away. He made his way to New England in 1635 along with his large family, many servants, and a part of his congregation. He may have already heard of Musquetaquid, probably from the English explorer William Wood, and reportedly told his 50 to 60 followers it appeared to be much like Odell, only perhaps a little bit wilder. Like many Puritans, Buckley had many children, 12 born in Odell from his first marriage, of whom 5 survived into adulthood, and another 4 born in Concord from his second marriage. His oldest son, Edward, was sent first to investigate this new land. Then his other sons, Thomas, John, George, and Daniel from his first marriage, along with his new wife, Grace, secretly escaped with him aboard the ship Susan and Ellen, arriving in Boston Harbor in May 1635. Buckley had been at college with the prominent Boston minister John Cotton, and he also knew many of the Boston area Puritan clergy by name and reputation. Buckley soon took his place in the Boston Puritan ministerial elite. Now we need to remember that Buckley and Willard weren't typical immigrants, but were part of a privileged elite from the very beginning, giving their heirs a big advantage in this new country being developed. In the New England of the 17th century, an extended family, grandparents, parents, children, siblings, indentured servants, hired hands, and slaves, generally all lived under one roof. We know from his writings that Reverend Buckley would have been uncomfortable having non-Puritan Christians living under his roof, whether Anglicans, Baptists, Freethinkers, or Catholics. So how much less would he conceive of indigenous people or Africans living with him on his homestead? Such views might change in coming generations, as they often would, but for the founding generation, remaining pure was key to Puritan theology. And Buckley remained a Puritan committed to white supremacy. This is not to disparage these white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Puritans. They were mostly righteous men and women, especially Buckley and Willard, but also people living in a white supremacy cultural context in which they thrived. His family prospered as New England prospered, its wealth built upon the lands and labor of the indigenous people, while enslaving both indigenous and African-American labor. Within 3 generations, at least some of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren were actively involved in colonial America's slave trade. New England was not rich in gold, silver, or natural resources like the Spanish colonies, so New England's wealth was built upon trade of all kinds. Buckley's great-grandson and namesake, Captain Peter Buckley, made a fortune in the Atlantic slave trade. Appropriating land and labor became a primary basis of wealth creation for the next 200 years in this new Massachusetts Commonwealth. Reverend Dr. Buckley was a scholar, initially the richest man in Concord, and his family had many servants, freeing him to focus on ministry and scholarship. When the town was established, Buckley used his capital, with Willard's help, to reach an agreement with the local indigenous people. He funded the building of the town's grist mill and tannery and became Concord's largest landowner. He was a major funder of the congregation's first meeting house and served as the congregation's co-minister. First Parish in Concord exists because of Peter Buckley. We should never forget that. And his descendants would become Concord's greatest benefactors. Some of his children would return to England. Others would move further west to Connecticut once the indigenous people had been cleared from those lands. One married the daughter of the president of Harvard, and with their wealth, they joined the New England white WASP elite. But let me tell you a few things about Concord's early days. There were 12 families that accompanied Willard and Buckley to settle on this land, which had once supported at least 300 indigenous people. The first sod-covered log houses they built were scattered along a dirt road between an esker hill and a small brook, about 2 miles north of the indigenous people's village on Neshonoc. They didn't have glass for windows, so the houses were dark with small openings to admit light. And they were often smoke-filled as they centered around a large fireplace used for cooking and heating, which consumed up to 7 cords of wood each year. The colonial land grant was allotted between land for dwellings, fields for growing food, meadows for growing fodder for their animals, and woodlots for their warmth and cooking. The newly settled colonists almost starved that first winter. They weren't quite sure how to survive a New England winter, and so depended heavily upon the local indigenous people teaching the English colonists how to plant and farm this native land. Their colonial land grant gave them permission to develop 6 square miles just beyond the western border of what was then the new colonial town of Watertown. They met the local indigenous leaders, Tehatuan, and the woman known to posterity as Squaw Sachem, and with the exchange of some commercial gifts, agreed to live together in peace. Now, what was understood by each side of this exchange is unclear, since the indigenous people spoke no English and only Willard spoke Algonquin, so their communication was fairly limited. The indigenous people had no concept of land ownership, and English laws initially granted the indigenous people no ownership rights under English law, essentially viewing the indigenous people who had lived on the land for countless generations as squatters on land claimed for England. This initial verbal treaty was most likely a simple agreement to live in peace. It's not clear how they could have agreed on anything else. Yet, being the richest person in town before that first winter, Buckley's sons and servants built him a proper English wood-framed house with semi-transparent oiled paper covering the windows so that Buckley and his growing family could live more in the style to which they were accustomed. The town selectmen, all of whom had to be male heads of household owning property to vote or join the church or hold public office, voted to allow Buckley to dam and flood the Mill Brook, the small brook to the south of the town, which they subsequently named the Mill Brook, to build the town's first grist mill and tannery. In doing so, they destroyed a weir, or fish trap, long maintained by indigenous people as the source of food. So the following year, the colonists, Victor, you've got a camera on a second time and you're disrupting this a little bit. So the following year, the colonists made another agreement compensating the indigenous people for the loss of their fishing rights, along with planting grounds that had previously been created by the Massachusetts tribe so that these two distinct peoples and cultures could learn to live together in peace. And living together in peace describes the first decades. However, the hierarchical class structure of the English colonists and their lesser understanding of their environment than the indigenous people meant that every landowner needed several landless sons or servants to maintain their farm's productivity. However, landless settlers, including the landowner's own sons and daughters, often dreamed of moving to new lands as they were taken over from the indigenous people, being open to the north and west of Concord. They often drifted away by ones and twos and so were readily replaced by newly arriving colonists, until by 1644, the town of Concord now consisted of 50 families. However, there was not now enough land for everyone, so in the year 1644, nearly 15% of the settlers of this small town, including Reverend John Jones, Buckley's co-minister in Concord, and 2 of Buckley's own sons, moved southwest to found Fairfield, Connecticut, on land recently taken over from the Pequots to make a better life for themselves. The English indentured servant system was proving less desirable and less than sustainable in changing circumstances. As long as England was hostile to religious nonconformists, particularly Puritans, there was a steady stream of new landless immigrants, more than enough to replace those dying or moving away, as well as those migrating further north and west of formerly landless English workers. But after the rise of Oliver Cromwell and the death of King George in the English Civil War, the influx of new Puritan settlers was interrupted, and what new settlers did immigrate often came from a lower stratum of English society and didn't have Puritan religious beliefs. So what began as an experiment by a radical religious sect now became far less faithful. However, the rise of New England as a commercial trading center, deeply involved in the triangle trade of capturing slaves in Africa, working them to death on the plantations of the Caribbean and the southern coast of North America, fed by agricultural surpluses, molasses, and rum from New England, created new opportunities for prosperity. The rural towns within a day's drive of Boston became important agricultural centers and sources of timber for this Atlantic triangle trade, enriching New England merchants, especially those willing to carry on their trade without following the niceties of English navigational transport laws, taxes, and duties. The grandchildren of the Puritan founders of Concord prospered mightily in this new world. So let me tell you first a little bit about indigenous and Black slaves, how they came to be here as slaves, enslaved. Squanto, who welcomed the Pilgrims in 1620 speaking English, was one of those indigenous people enslaved by English traders and fishermen along the coast in the year 1614. One of the early shipments of enslaved Africans to arrive in Salem, Mass. Was in 1638, shortly after Concord was founded. The ship Desire had sailed to the West Indies with a cargo of enslaved indigenous people from New England, and then returned with cotton, tobacco, and enslaved Africans in return. By the 17th century, sons of prominent Puritan founders of Massachusetts, such as Cotton Mather and John Winthrop Jr., were prominent slave owners. In her book, New England Bound, Wendy Warren writes that by the end of the century, when the English population was somewhere around 90,000 people, there were 1,500 enslaved Africans in the region and a roughly equivalent number of Indians in some form of captivity. So 1,500 enslaved Africans and 1,500 enslaved indigenous people. Enslavement of human beings was a large part of the success of the early colonial economy. It's not an artifact, it's not to the side, it was a piece of how the economy worked. When the Pilgrims arrived in 1620, the Wampanoags of Cape Cod had already lost at least 90% of their people to disease in the previous decade. And so they needed to ally with these English settlers against the much stronger Pequot nation west of them. When the Puritans arrived in Mass Bay, they had discovered the same was true of the Massachusetts tribe, who greeted them there as well. And by 1637, 1638, the year after Concord was founded, and the first year we have records of Black enslaved people being brought into Boston, the United Colonists and their indigenous allies decided to exterminate this troublesome Pequot nation in what is now Connecticut. What had been a fierce tribe of 20,000 Pequots in 1630 had been decimated by a 1633-1634 outbreak of smallpox. So by 1637, there were only about 4,000 of them left, of whom less than 900 were experienced warriors. The ensuing war killed over half the men, women, and children remaining, some of them in horrific slaughter by the colonists, with over 1,000 more sold into Caribbean slavery. So by 1640, there were less than 300 Pequots left on their ancestral lands. I don't know what to call this other than genocide. And those lands were now populated by settlers moving out from Massachusetts. Puritan Massachusetts legalized slavery for African and indigenous people in 1641, but it was initially confined to the commercial cities like Boston or Salem along the coasts. However, as the Concord area businessmen with extensive commercial interests in the New England, Africa, Caribbean triangle trade engaged in buying and selling slaves, they gradually began to use them on their plantation estates as well. By the late 17th century, large estates such as the Codman Plantation in what is now Lincoln, or the John Cumming Estate, which is now in what is now West Concord, began to substitute enslaved workers to replace turnover among their landless indentured white servants. Servitude became racial, often justified by theories of race. It is estimated that between the 16th and 19th centuries, nearly 13 million Africans were enslaved and shipped across the Atlantic, and nearly 3 million indigenous people were captured and enslaved, often shipped to the Caribbean in exchange for African slaves to serve the New England households. Most enslaved people in New England lived in the important commercial ports and cities, but before the town of Concord was even 100 years old, the domestic roles formerly performed by landless English immigrants were now often fulfilled by the purchase of African, or less often indigenous enslaved people. This was particularly true for Concord's professional class, doctors, lawyers, and ministers, and landowners without enough sons to work the farm. Enslaved people cost far less than English hired help, and so fulfilled a very real economic need for the wealthiest of the colonial elite. This was here for a reason. Now, most of the Puritans never entirely lost their sense that Roman Catholics, or Africans, and even the indigenous native people were damned, and possibly in league with the powers of darkness, leading them into evil. Thus, while an indigenous person could be hanged or sold into slavery for stealing from a white man could kill an indigenous person without legal consequences any greater than killing a bear or deer in the forest. Neither indigenous people nor free Africans could initially own property, vote in elections, hold public office, or have any voice in the affairs of the church or town. They were never treated as equal citizens. So what do we know about what happened to the Concord's indigenous people? Well, given Tehadawon's early decision to side with the English settlers and to accept Christianity for his family and his tribe, the Eastern Nipmunks remained peacefully engaged with Concord. Simon Willard moved onto indigenous land at the foot of Neshotic Hill and secured colonial monopolies for trading with the local indigenous people in furs, food, and alcohol. He became their protector, and they became the primary source of his wealth. Initially, they paid for their purchases in beaver skins, but after the local beaver population was decimated, they had no choice but to pay their debts by selling him their land. Over the next 25 years, Willard became one of Concord's largest and wealthiest landowners, and with even more land acquired from Nipmunks living further west from Concord. And this arrangement worked for both sides for many years. He helped to protect them from settlers who just wanted to take their land without payment. However, by the mid-1640s, the beaver population around Concord began to collapse from over-harvesting of furs. After that, the indigenous people would rack up substantial debts to Major Willard with no income with which to settle these debts, so they gradually signed over their lands to Willard in settlement of their debts, with Willard eventually coming to own all of Neshotic Hill and its environs, as well as thousands of acres further west in what would become part of the colonial towns of Harvard, Groton, and Lancaster. With the help of Reverend John Eliot, these now landless Christian Indians who had allied with the English colonists were granted a reservation in 1654 for praying Indians, which was the name they gave them, called Neshoba, in what is now part of Littleton. This reservation system worked for another generation until King Philip's War in 1675 made many colonists fearful of all indigenous people. When the Western Nipmunks turned hostile to the settlers, it made all Nipmunks suspect, and in many ways, all indigenous people suspect. By now, Tehadawon was dead, but his English-speaking son, John Tehadawon, and two daughters, one of whom married the indigenous Christian minister Wabin, and Tehadawon's grandchildren were among the 58 Christian indigenous people living on the Neshoba Reservation just west of Concord. To save their lives from colonial vigilantes, the colonial court in Boston sent Reverend John Eliot and Major Simon Willard, who they knew that the indigenous people trusted, to bring them into Concord for safety. The prominent Concord lawyer, John Hoare, agreed to hold them unarmed under lock and key in his barn in the center of town. However, this was not enough to assuage the fears of Concord's citizens. So when Captain Samuel Mosley arrived with a warrant to round up any and all indigenous people, with his troops being paid from the proceeds from selling them into slavery, the town voted to let them take them, and Hoare was unable to prevent their arrest. So the last of Concord's indigenous people were imprisoned on Deer Island in Boston Harbor, and eventually most were sold into slavery. By any other name, this is genocide again. I'm particularly disturbed by the fact that that town meeting was held in First Parish's meeting house. Reverend Joseph Estabrook, the church's and the town's minister and a direct descendant of Buckley, was present at that meeting, but there's no record of his raising any moral objections to selling Teharawan's Christian grandchildren into slavery. Let me tell you a little more about Concord's black slaves. Black slaves became far more prominent in Concord, Massachusetts in the 1740s during the ministry of Reverend Daniel Bliss of First Parish. This was during the so-called Great Awakening, which renewed the Puritans' belief that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or WASPs, were God's special chosen people. Reverend Bliss, trained at Yale's New Congregational School in New Haven, was First Parish's most evangelical minister. He brought deep emotion and charisma into First Parish's pulpit and owned at least 2 slaves, providing domestic servants so that he could focus upon his ministry and the life of the mind. While Black people never became a large portion of Concord's population, many of the Harvard-educated professionals, as well as many well-to-do yeoman farmers without sufficient sons to work their land, purchased or were gifted enslaved Black people as servants to work on their farms. When First Parish renovated our meeting house in 1749, we expanded the less desirable pews to create greater seating capacity for paupers and enslaved Black people. Now, Reverend Bliss's daughter Phoebe's life would span most of the 100 years during which Black slaves were most common in Concord. Born in 1741, Phoebe grew up in a slave-holding household. She was in her 20s when her father died, throwing her family into financial uncertainty. Bliss's widow agreed to bring Concord's new 20-something-year-old minister, Reverend William Emerson, a direct descendant of Concord's founding minister, Reverend Buckley, into their household as a boarder. These 2 young people fell deeply in love and married, with Reverend Emerson commissioning the building what we now know as the Old Manse, as a home for the 2 of them to build a family together. Over the next 9 years, they would raise 5 children in that house, with the help of their Black slaves, Kate, Phyllis, and Frank. Reverend Emerson was a patriot and in 1775-1776 served as chaplain to the Continental Army, where he died. But his slaves maintained his farm in his absence, and this was considered unremarkable in late 18th century Concord. When First Parish chose another young minister, Ezra Ripley, as its new minister, he agreed to board at Widow Emerson's house to help her meet her ongoing costs. Well, these 2 soon also fell in love, and they were married for another 50 years. They saw the creation of the United States with a slavery accommodating constitution. Slavery is in the Constitution. They saw the industrialization of Concord, the introduction of the railroad and devastatingly poor Irish immigrants, and the end of slavery in Concord. It's not exactly clear when or how Ezra and Phoebe emancipated their slaves, but they were in the last generations of Concord's prominent slaveholders. Their grandson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, would make no reference to their slaves. Irish immigrants would instead increasingly take on this role in Concord for Emerson and other wealthy families. So Concord's rigid class structure remained while legal human bondage ended. So what do we know about Concord's emancipated slaves? What happened when slavery ended? John Jack, born in 1712, was enslaved to Benjamin Barron, who married Betty Paris, who's actually one of the girls at the center of the Salem witch trial. Phoebe Bliss was about 10 when Jack earned his freedom. Jack had worked the Barron's farm for 4 decades along with another slave, Violet Bonds, who served as their household domestic. Benjamin's daughter, Susanna, inherited these 2 slaves when her father died, and she allowed Jack to work to earn his freedom while keeping Violet as her domestic the rest of her life. John Jack became Concord's first Black landowner on wasteland between Concord's Great Meadow and Great Field. And upon his death, he bequeathed his estate to Violet Bonds. When he died in 1773, Phoebe's brother Daniel, Concord's then most prominent lawyer, got Concord's selectmen to allow John Jack to be the first formerly enslaved person to be buried in Concord's Old Hill burying ground. You can still find the tombstone on the back side of the Old Hill burying ground right across from First Parish. On it is an epitaph that is getting hard to read after these centuries, but I'll tell you what it says. God wills us free, man makes us slaves. I will as God wills, God's will be done. Here lies the body of John Jack, a native of Africa who died March 1773, aged about 60 years. Though born in a land of slavery, he was born free. Though he lived in a land of liberty, he lived a slave, till by his honest though stolen labors he acquired the source of slavery, which gave him his freedom. Though not long before death, that great tyrant gave him his final emancipation and set him on footing with kings. Though a slave to vice, he practiced those virtues without which kings are but slaves. Now we need to remember that while the American Revolution sped up the process, in fact, freedom was gradually becoming a reality for enslaved people in Concord. Cesar Robbins was born 4 years after Phoebe Bliss and died 3 years before her. So for 76 years, Cesar Robbins was her contemporary in Concord. He spent the first 30 years of his life enslaved to Lieutenant Humphrey Barrett of the colonial militia. Barrett's Mill, named after him, fought in the Revolutionary War and was emancipated following the war. Master Barrett allowed his former slave to squat on wasteland between Concord's Great Meadow and Great Field, where Cesar built a house in which 3 generations of his offspring would live. It appears Cesar may also have been the common law husband of Phoebe's slave Phyllis, whose daughter Phyllis Bliss Ingraham was born enslaved. Cesar's son Peter was born free, however, after he went on to marry Fatima Oliver and purchased the land his father had built his house upon, but in desperate financial desperation was not able to settle the debt. His sister Susan Robbins married Jack Garrison, who was an escaped slave from New Jersey, and Master Robbins would grant them a life tenancy to raise their family on the land her father had built upon. In 1852, Peter Hutchinson, Peter Robbins' cousin by marriage, bought the property, and his large family was the last of the extended Robbins clan to live in the 2-family house, which is now a small Concord museum. The Revolutionary War, which was fought for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was a turning point for many enslaved people in Concord, Massachusetts. According to research by Elise Lemire, there were 32 enslaved people living in Concord, about 2% of the town's population at the beginning of the Revolution. Scipio Brister, owned by John and Elizabeth Hoare, was freed following the Revolution. The slave Philip, owned by Colonel James Barrett, the leader of Concord's revolutionary forces, fought in the militia with his master and was emancipated following the war. Another African slave named Case was enslaved by Samuel Whitney, the patriot muster master, but ran away to fight in the war, returning to Concord a free man when his master fled to England at the end of the war. The African Cato was enslaved to Concord's richest landowner, Dr. Joseph Lee. Even though freed following the Revolution, he remained a poorly paid laborer living and working on the Lee estate for the rest of his life. We know that Concord's largest slave estate was owned by the Chambers-Russell-Codman family. Dr. Charles Russell inherited 6 slaves, including Lincoln, Bilnah, Peter, Ishmael, Zilpah, and Brister. He became the owner of more slaves upon his marriage to Elizabeth Vassall, a member of Massachusetts' largest slave-owning family, the Royals of Medford. And his ward, Sea Captain John Codman, a Charlestown merchant, made a fortune from the slave trade, but was notoriously cruel to his slaves, leading 3 of his slaves to rise up and murder him. Of his 3 convicted murderers, the slave Mark was hanged and publicly displayed in Charlestown. Phoebe was sold to the West Indies, and Phyllis was burned at the stake. This slave uprising seems to have brought an end to slavery on the Codman estate in Concord, now part of Lincoln, just down the road from Walden Pond, but memory of it lingered in town long afterwards. Decades later, Henry David Thoreau, while living in Walden Pond, writes about his early 19th century near neighbors. Brister Freeman, who grew up enslaved on the Codman estate, was gifted as a wedding present to John Cumming and freed during the Revolution. Brister married an African former slave named Fenda and became Concord's second Black formerly enslaved landowner, raising 3 generations on land he bought in Walden Woods, including his son Amos and his grandson John Freeman. The slave Cato, who was enslaved to Sea Captain Junkin Ingraham, was freed upon Cato's marriage to Phyllis Bliss, so his wedding present was to be given his freedom. Phyllis Bliss was the daughter of slaves of the Bliss Emerson family, and they together rented land in Walden Woods to live upon. As many as 15 former slaves lived in Walden Woods along the road from Concord to the former Codman estate, often as squatters with no legal rights. Concord's third area of formerly enslaved people was on the former Cumming estate west of Concord, near where the Concord Rotary is today. Cumming was one of Concord's wealthiest landowners, owning Brister, Gem, and others, but being loyal to the king, he fled to Canada during the Revolution. Thomas Dugan, an escaped slave from Virginia, became Concord's third former slave to own land, buying less desirable land near the old Marlborough Road. He farmed the land while his wife worked as a domestic servant in Concord. The local spring that fed their land is still known locally as the Jenny Dugan Spring, after his second wife, but with children to feed, they could barely make ends meet. They often starved. Like most formerly enslaved Blacks in Concord, they lived in extreme poverty at the margins of society, and there was little community support or concern for their livelihood. These Black Concordians remained outside of proper white supremacy WASP society in Concord, and was not that society's concern for the most part. And that is ultimately the story of Concord's freed Blacks, desperately trying to make a living on the edges of a WASP town, often living in extreme poverty and isolation. Elise Lemire tells us that while the overall mortality rate in Concord from 1779 to 1853 was under 2% annually, so average lifetime mortality of 50 years, mortality rates for Blacks living in extreme poverty were far, far higher. Cesar Robbins buried a third of his children. Jack Garrison buried half of his children. And 100% of Peter Hutchinson's children died young. Other Black families in Concord reported similarly high child mortality rates. So by the mid-19th century, 200 years after Concord's founding, Indigenous and Black families had mostly departed from Concord, increasingly replaced by inexpensive, poor Irish day laborers and domestic servants. These Indigenous and Black communities are, however, still an important part of Concord's story that should be told. So let me end with a few words about post-colonial Concord so I can bring us up to date. By 1885, Concord would become famous for its abolitionists, including Mary Merrick Brooks, the daughter of slave owners, and Susan Garrison, the daughter of a slave, who together founded the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society along with Lydia Emerson and Thoreau's mother and sisters. By the 1850s, Concord abolitionists became an important link on the Underground Railroad to freedom for people fleeing slavery and helped fund John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry. We rightly became world famous as the cradle of American liberty. Concord can claim that heritage, yet Indigenous people, colonial settlers, indentured servants, slaves, and poor Irish immigrants are all still part of Concord's story. Each played an important role in Concord's history and growing prosperity. So how do we justify the deeply skewed distribution of results among them? White supremacy culture is, however, still present at First Parish in the 21st century. Walk into our parish hall when the pandemic is over and you encounter portraits of our honored ancestors, most of whom are white males, and include several whose families' wealth and well-being was based upon acquiring the Indigenous people's land without adequate compensation, two of whom owned African slaves while serving as ministers of First Parish, and some of whom held virulent anti-immigrant views as well into the 20th century, and many of whom felt that white culture was far superior to other cultures. This image that we show of who we are portrays a certain image to the wider world. And this is a question for our visual culture. Who do we want to be? Where we honor white families that grew rich on Indigenous people land, but not the Indigenous people themselves. We honor WASP men who enslaved African Americans, but not the enslaved African Americans themselves. What does this say about First Parish? Who's welcome here? Where are the portraits of Tehadawan or Squaw Sachem, of John Jack or Brister Freeman, of Mary Merrick Brooks or Susan Garrison, all of whom lived closer to First Parish and was more involved in First Parish than I am today, or I do today? I would gladly contribute to help pay the cost of painting their portraits and hanging them in the parish hall to replace 6 of the dead white men and better reflect the diversity living in this place. Concord has, of course, adapted with the times. In 1985, 350 years after First Parish's founding, the Unitarian Universalist Association, of which First Parish is the largest congregation in New England, adopted as its first principle the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Now we hang a Black Lives Matter banner in front of our building. But given our long and complicated history, is that nearly enough? How do we make inherent worth real and meaningful? Whose stories do we tell? Perhaps we could start with the First Parish Standing Committee formally acknowledging our nearly 400 years of white supremacy in this place. It's part of who we are. It's the DNA of First Parish. And then how do we justify that the descendants of Simon Willard and Peter Bulkeley grew rich and seemingly as numerous as the stars, with many prospering from the land and labor taken from indigenous and Black people, while the descendants of Tehadawan and Squassacham would mostly die out or be sold into slavery? How do we justify that over the next 150 years, the descendants of the white settlers and newer white immigrants participated in a 5-fold increase in the American standard of living, while the descendants of the indigenous and formerly enslaved were often blocked from participation in this enormous wealth creation? I don't know what's fair and reasonable, but it appears to me that there's a debt to be paid, and it's time that we begin discussing it. For if First Parish is committed to the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, as our first two principles affirm, then bringing justice, equity, and compassion to this question is certainly required. Thank you. And Victor, I'm happy to go back for any questions if people have them.
Thank you, Jim. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. And I do have a few questions that I'd like to share with you. And also, I do want to let everyone know that this program has been recorded. I apologize for having difficulties getting started on time, and I will send everyone a link to watch the recording. So here is a question. Would you comment on the idea that there is a way in which the genocide of the Nipmuc mirrors the deaths of so many marginalized people in today's pandemic?
Well, it's certainly the same issue. If you're trying to decide culturally who are you doing for, who the police work for, who do the laws work for, how is the country organized? In the case of the Nipmunks, basically they had no standing under English law. It was clear that from the beginning that they were not included in the we the people. Today, it's a little more ambivalent that the we the people, we believe theoretically includes all the citizens of the United States. But when you look at the economic situation, you can say it clearly doesn't always apply. Certainly not equally.
Thank you. Next, I'm trying to construct a land acknowledgement, a short saying that the First Parish can use when people are starting a meeting or presentation or conference to pay respect to the Native Americans who lived in the Concord area. What should we say? Who should we say were here and how?
So we have records going back 11,000 years of the Nipmuc people being here. So they were the primary generation to generation people here. There's a lot of turmoil, as I indicated at the beginning of the talk, in the first couple decades of the 17th century. So as some of the Nipmunks moved further west to get away from the pandemic and the English colonists or died, it created this enormous vacuum, and the Massachusetts Indians who were survivors, came further west here and settled some of that land. So it's probably correctly described as the Nipmuc land, which also included Massachusetts people.
Thank you, Jim. Next question, how do we create an open and honest permanent acknowledgement of what came out of Peter Bulkeley's wealth? and other slave owners and their wealth? How do we incorporate this recognition into the core of the stories that we tell about Concord?
Well, it's a complicated issue because we now have many generations that have been here. And if you look at what happened with his descendants who stayed in Concord, Walden Pond State Reservation wouldn't exist except for them. Estabrook Woods as a reservation would not exist except for them. A number of the best, they have been the biggest landowners and some of the wealthiest families in town. And they love this town and have put back, contributed back and been benefactors for the town over many generations. But I think at some point we probably need to do the research and say, of First Parish's building and wealth and its endowment, what portion of it came from people whose wealth came initially from owning land that had been taken from the indigenous people without much compensation? What portion of it came from people who had enslaved Africans working for them during the 100 years when African slavery was common in Concord? Not because we want to necessarily take that money and do something with it, but we ought to know the truth of where it comes from, where the wealth of the First Parish comes, before we're trying to decide what to do with it.
Thank you, Jim. Here is just a further resource that has been recommended. I would urge those who want to know more about these stories to consult the research and publications of the Robbins House. They've been able to expand upon and sometimes refute the earlier suppositions about enslaved and African-American people in Concord. And if you look in the chat thread, you will see a link to the Robbins House website where you can find much of that research.
And it should be important for everybody to understand that this is new research that's been emerging over the last decade or so. And a lot of the things that we're putting in place, my facts included, is our best reading of the data. But as more data comes forward, the story will evolve. So I don't take anything I said today as given truth that somehow I have, that I was there 400 years ago and so know what happened. But it's my interpretation of all of the available data we have in our hands. And as more comes forward, we'll learn more. Someone in the chat is asking about how about the Pawtuckets and the Pennacooks. This is a problem. Most of what we have is a description of the tribes that lived in these areas come from the settlers who didn't speak Algonquin and often confused one tribe for another. So if you say the local people who are supporting the indigenous people here, they're in Lowell or in Bedford, they're the Micmacs, which is a sub-tribe of the Abenakis. The Pawtucket and the Pennacook, by the time we're talking about, as far as I know, had all moved further west or down into Rhode Island, that they weren't actually the indigenous people that were dealing with the Concord settlers. But many of the Massachusetts ones that were dealing with the Concord settlers had only recently, in recent decades, moved onto this land. So it's a confused mess. And those of us with historical training are trying to untangle the web, but know that in that situation, 2 decades from now, we will tell the story differently than we do today, which is considerably different than it was 2 decades ago.
I think that's why what you're doing is so important, because these are stories that for decades and even centuries were not told. And we're starting to tell these stories now, and the more we tell, the more comes to light. So thank you for your good work along these lines. We have a few comments and questions about your idea regarding images of an indigenous and African people in the visual environment of First Parish. One commenter suggests that you actively seek out, or whoever is involved actively seek out artists of color to paint the portraits of Native Americans and African Americans. There's also a comment room for a professionally done poster display of the inclusive history of Indigenous and African American peoples to First Parish as a social action project for First Parish. So that there's another very good initiative there.
Do we have an issue that is increasingly, there's an emerging way to deal with the issue, which is that in the period, in the 17th century, if you were Simon Willard or you were Peter Buckley, chances are somebody would paint your portrait because you were considered an important person. If you were an indigenous person or an enslaved person, no one's likely to have painted your portrait. So we don't actually know what many of them look like directly. But what's emerging in the field is the notion that we still want to look at them, and that the oldest portraits we have are usually badly done. So that the Wampanoag, earliest Wampanoag pictures we have make them look like they're Plains Indians. And so, but you could take what we do know about the culture of the Nipmunks and the facial features of the Nipmunks still living in Western Massachusetts, and have a person of color who wanted to do the research and was a reasonable artist, give you a pretty good sense of what Tatawan looked like. And having that is probably more important than the precise accuracy, having something that we can visually remember that this was their land first. They were here when the colonists came.
Thank you. I have a question. Can you say more about Squaw Sachem, or the woman we know as Squaw Sachem, and attitudes towards women?
Yeah. So who got to be the leader, the Sagama or the Sachem for a tribe, usually was passed down from father to son, and that there were usually two leaders: the military leader, and then the wisdom leader. The two usually got along quite closely. But what happens in a number of places where if the military leader dies in battle, but is well respected, his wife can step into the role as the leader of the people because she's respected for that. And this appears to be what happened, is when her husband died in a battle with the Abenaki Indians, the hostile tribe to the north, she was first offered to marry and become a wife to the medicine man of their tribe, who was very close with both she and her husband. And that when they moved out here, because he was focused more on healing and wisdom, she took the role as the leader of the tribe. And that's why she's known to us as Squaw Sachem, that it was a novelty to the English colonists that they thought that a woman should never lead. But as far as we can tell in indigenous culture, while it wasn't the dominant model, it was not an infrequent model for them to step into the leadership role if their husband was killed. Not unlike where a queen might end up running a country if the king for some reason dies.
There's more about that in Lisa Brooks's book, Our Beloved Kin. She's Native American and university professor, and has written a book about the colonial New England era relations between the English and Native peoples. And she talks a little bit about that. Lisa Brooks is her name. Another question, do we know where Africans enslaved by the ministers of First Parish are buried?
I think so far the answer to that is no. That for the most part, you had to be somebody who important to get buried in the burying grounds. And there certainly cost a fair amount of money to bury you in the burying grounds. So you either had to have some wealth, which even the freed Africans didn't have, or have a sponsor. So it's fairly unique that we have John Jack, where Phoebe's brother Daniel steps in and basically pays for the cost and then argues in the town meeting to let them give him a site. And again, it says something about the period when they agreed to give him a site. It wasn't a random site or a prominent site. They agreed only if they put him on the far back side of the burying ground, facing away from First Parish. So this was a concession to made, and you can still visit that tombstone. But for most of the other freed Black, formerly enslaved people, we don't know where they ended up being buried. They were often buried wherever they died. So there's probably a fair number of them buried somewhere in the Walden Woods. but we don't, because that was often considered wasteland. It wouldn't have been buried on the farmland or where the houses were, but in rural settings. And if they were living, as many of them were, as squatters on wasteland, then that's probably where they would be buried.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you all for joining us and asking so many insightful questions, and for the polite and respectful way that you've addressed your questions about this very difficult subject to talk about. There are, in the chat thread that I would recommend that you take a look at, some links to other resources, books, to a program that is coming up on Friday in Harvard, Massachusetts, and there's a link to that. It does say in the chat thread that it is sold out, but might be recorded. I would just click the link and see what you're able to find out. But this is a program by Nipmuc for their Warner Free Lecture on this Friday. So a number of people.
Now small museums for the Pequots down in Connecticut, for the Wampanoags down on the Cape, for the Narragansetts in Rhode Island. And now I hear there's one out now for the Nipmunks in somewhere just west of Worcester. So we're starting to find places where we can find the history as told by Indigenous people survivors from this horrible genocide.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's not easy to talk about these things, but it's vital that we do talk about them, and I appreciate your sharing your research with us. And thank all of our attendees. Once again, I apologize that we had trouble getting the program launched at the beginning, but we will have it recorded, and I will send everyone the link to the recording. So, Happy New Year, everyone.
Shelley and Rich.
Oh yes, that's right. We do have a new program coming up, April 6th, is it?
Well,
it's in April. So watch the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord, our Facebook page. We'll have the details about that. And this is a program by Shelley Hawkes and Rich Higgins, and it's about Thoreau and Thoreau and Hawthorne. So it's a double header. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your Sunday.
I know.